On September 27, 2002, Willem Kolff was awarded the Albert Lasker Award for Clinical Medical Research for the development of renal hemodialysis. Willem Kolff is interviewed by CBS journalist Emily Sine.
Hello, I'm Dr. Emily Sine of CBS News. I'm here in New York City to speak with Dr. Willem Kolff, who was this year's Lasker Clinical Medical Research Awardee for his work on artificial organs, particularly kidney dialysis. Good morning, Dr. Kolff. Thank you for being here.
Okay.
Tell me, the artificial kidney has done so much for so many people. When you first began to work on it, what were you more interested in? Was it the kidney or the idea of an artificial organ?
No, I was motivated by a young man who was dying from renal failure. This was the time that nothing could be done about renal failure. I remember people that were in profound renal failure that would have a moustache of urea. The urea crystals would be on their lips here. And I had a young man, 22 years old, and I was a very young resident at the University of Groningen in the Netherlands. And I had to tell his mother that we could not do anything about it. She was an only son, and I had to tell his mother. I had only 4 patients. He was one of my first patients, and I was deeply impressed. And I thought, if I could only remove 20 grams of urea every day, this young man could live. And that didn't let me loose. And then I fortunately met a Professor Brinkman, who was familiar with dialysis, and he brought me also in contact with artificial sausage skin, which is a very good dialyzing membrane. And so in Groningen already in '39, I began to do experiments to determine how much of this artificial sausage skin I would need. And I had a piece of artificial sausage skin about this long, and I didn't fill it like a sausage. I put in only a little blood. I put knots at the end, and then I put it in a bath with saline. And I shook it up and down in that bath of saline. And in 5 minutes, to my surprise, I found that all the urea, 400 milligrams percent, that I had added to that blood was removed by dialysis. I had never realized that dialysis could be so fast. So this was about the length of cellophane I had, multiplied with 20, and I knew that I had to make a machine that would have to have 10 or 20 meters of cellophane tubing, and that the blood inside there should be a small amount, and it should be in continuous movement, and the dialyzing fluid around should also be in continuous movement. And I tried various things, and none of them worked very well. Then the war came, and I didn't want to work under a National Socialist, so I left and found a place in Kampen, K-A-M-P-E-N. And there I approached the director of the enamel factory, and I asked him to make the rotating drum artificial kidney. Now the rotating drum is about this long and this wide, and you wrap the cellophane tubing around it. And then when the drum rotates, it rotates with its lower end through a tank of a bath with dialyzing fluid. Was no problem because it's an enamel factory and they could make a large enamel tank for it. And the blood had to get in through one hollow axle and out through the other hollow axle. And that was the first artificial kidney with a large enough surface area that it was clinically useful. And the first patient was treated in 1943. Next year it will be 60 years, and I hope that a delegation of kidney patients from the United States will come to Kampen in the Netherlands to thank the burgomaster of Kampen for the help that the city gave me. These were war years, very difficult. And
the Nazis had come in.
Nazi occupation, Holland. And
that plays into your first success with dialysis, doesn't it?
The first success came later. That was patient number 17. So patient number 15 survived, but he might have survived if I had done something else. So that isn't, but patient number 17, that was right after the war in 45, was Maria Schafstad. And she was the first patient where I can say her life was really saved by dialysis. She was already 68 years old, she was comatose, and she was in the prison in which we kept collaborators with Nazi Germany. And when she was very sick, she was brought to me, and I dialyzed for 6 or 8 hours and bent over and said, "Mrs. Schafstad, can you hear me?" She slowly opened her eyes and said, "I'm going to divorce my husband." That were her first years, and later on she did. So that was the first patient who was saved.
But you took a little heat for her, for the treatment that you gave her.
What?
Some people felt you were not doing the right thing because she was a Nazi collaborator.
Yes, but you know, when you are a physician, you don't ask anything. You treat the patient who needs you.
Did you ever doubt, after those first early experiments that demonstrated that you could take the urea out of the blood through the sausage tubing, that it would be clinically useful? Did you imagine that it would be difficult to...
Oh no, I was from the very first beginning convinced that this could be done. Well, we were already well on our way. I read a paper by Abel, Roundtree and Turner, which was published in 1913, and funny enough, it was first talked about in Groningen, where I studied medicine, in 1912. I was 1 year old and I do not remember that. But it didn't lead anywhere. The artificial kidney made in Kampen was the first one that was clinically worthwhile.
How quickly after those first rotating drum dialyzers did you then see it become something that was more widely used? When did it really become something that it is today, a worldwide life-saving device?
It became worldwide used when in 1955 we made the so-called twin coil artificial kidney, which was made around a fruit juice can. So we had cellophane tubing, that is the artificial sausage skin, 2 rolls of it, and we had rolls of window screening, the stuff that you keep the flies out your house with. And in between the cellophane, in between the window screening was the cellophane, and the blood went through the cellophane, and the fruit juice cooled. The fruit juice can was put in a tank.
As briefly as you can, explain the principle behind the cellophane tubing and the bath that it sits in. What does it do to help the blood?
If you have, the blood is inside the cellophane tubing, and the urea and other retention products are in the blood. So during dialysis, the urea goes out through the pores of the membrane, and since there is none in the dialyzing fluid, it goes out. Also, the salts, sodium, potassium, etc., that are in the blood plasma are exchanged. And to the dialyzing fluid, we add these salts in the proper composition. So, if the sodium of the patient is too high, sodium goes out. If it is too low, sodium comes in. Actually, to go in and out, equilibration takes place. And in the third place, you want to remove water. If the cellophane, if the blood in the cellophane is under pressure, the water goes out by filtration. So these are the 3 functions. If you have the rotating drum kidney, you don't have a pressure difference. Then you add glucose to the dialyzing fluid, and an osmotic pressure will take the water out.
So it draws it through the cellophane into the bath.
Correct.
This was the beginning for you, really, as far as artificial organs are concerned. It wasn't the end. Was it the success with the kidney that got you so interested in continuing on and doing so much research in artificial organs?
It was much, much earlier. As soon as we have had very sick patients on the rotating drum artificial kidney, and the blood was inside, and the blood was blue, the patient was ill, and the blood was blue, we could see that it became red.
When
So
it went through the dialyzer.
And that meant that oxygen went through the membrane into the blood, and we recognized that we had a membrane oxygenator. And we followed through on that in Cleveland. We unrolled the twin-coiled kidneys in the hall, and we pulled out the cellophane, and we pulled in the polyethylene membrane and unrolled them up again. And those were the first clinically useful membrane oxygenators. So that gave us the membrane oxygenators.
And when would that be useful clinically?
The membrane oxygenators are now used in heart-lung machines. There are other types of oxygenators, but the membrane oxygenators are by far the best. And more than 50% of the heart-lung machines now use membrane oxygenators. So that was the second use then, membrane oxygenators. Well, the membrane oxygenators led us to heart failure and led us to the cardiac assist devices and to the artificial heart. And as you probably know, Barney Clark, the dentist from Seattle, was the first patient who was treated with a quotation mark permanent artificial heart.
Explain your role in that.
I brought the team together that did it, and it was at the University of Utah. I'm not a surgeon. De Vries was the surgeon who put the heart inside the chest of Barney Clark. And Barney Clark lived for 112 days. Now, in animals we had proved, in many, many animals, that we could do it. In calves, the trouble was they would live so long that they became large cows, and then the heart wasn't sufficient anymore to carry them, so we went over to sheep, and there was no doubt about it that we could do it. But in Barney Clark we could prove that he still had his considerable sense of humor. He still loved his family. He still wanted to serve mankind. So that all the functions of the brain that are really important were preserved. And presently, that same type of artificial heart is used at the latest version of it had the name of the cardio-vest heart, but it's the same principle. It's used for patients that are waiting on the donor list for a heart transplant. And I think it is a national disgrace that so many of them die. And there is a very wrong rule presently in the United States. People that are on the waiting list for a heart transplant are bumped off the #1 position when a patient comes in who's going to die tonight, tomorrow, or day after tomorrow. As a consequence, the healthy donor heart is given to a very sick patient. And when you do that, the mortality of the recipients is 25%. Actually, you have 200% mortality there. You have a dead donor heart and you have a dead patient. Mr. Hanover at Temple University in Philadelphia was #1 on the waiting list. And he kept a record of the people that replaced him from the #1 position, and found that 25% of them died. And I think that Tommy Thompson, our Secretary of Health, who makes propaganda for getting more donor hearts, must realize that he is losing 25% of these hearts. They are hard to combine. And the first rule they should make is that a donor heart, which is such a valuable thing, should be used only in a patient who is in good clinical condition. And you can bring them in good clinical condition by giving them first an artificial heart until they are in perfect condition, or use an LVAD, left ventricular assist device, and then you must set up centers. And these centers should have perfusionists. Perfusionists are more important than doctors for these things, so that the perfusionists can keep these patients, and very soon they will be in very good condition and they want to go home. And they should be allowed to go home. And then...
Well, what's interesting is that you still retain a lot of activity in all these different areas that are really somewhat disparate. I mean, you're considered the father of the artificial organ and your work continues, but through the years, did you become more of an innovator, more of a researcher, and less of a clinical physician, or have you always looked at yourself as both?
Well, I remained a clinical practical physician in Salt Lake City when I was also the head of a dialysis center. But around 85, I gave that up, and I gave the dialysis center to nephrologists. And then I concentrated on research. But I still remain very active in considering what happens to all these things. Let me tell you something about the artificial eye. In 1968, when I was 67, I went from Cleveland to Salt Lake City and set up an institute for artificial organs. And one day, a young man stepped in my office, and his name was Bill Dobell. And Bill Dobell said he wanted to come and work with me on the artificial heart. I took him to the cafeteria, gave him a cheeseburger, and said, "Why don't you rather work on artificial vision?" And he thought about it, and went then for 3 weeks to other places to compare very good work. Then came back and said, "Yes, I will work with you on artificial vision." And we very rapidly agreed on what we were going to do. We recognized that we had to work on human subjects. And Bill Dobell, and with the Vice President of Research, convinced the chairman of General Instrument to donate an entire microcircuit laboratory to the University of Utah, which gave him a $4 million tax deduction. And I became the director of that microcircuit laboratory, although I don't know anything about it. But we needed it to make the ingredients for the artificial eye. Then from Salt Lake, I called Dr. Doan at the Cleveland Clinic, who's a neurosurgeon who I knew well. And I asked him if he had a patient who would have the occipital lobe of the brain exposed under local anesthesia, so that Dobell would come over and stimulate it electrically. And he said, "Well, 3 weeks from now I have such a patient. Why don't you send him over?" So Dobell went to the Cleveland Clinic, went into the operating room, which he had never seen before, let alone a neurosurgical operating room, with his equipment. Brain was open, patient under local anesthesia, and he brought a little electrical current on the brain, and the patient said, "I see a drop of light." And that was the beginning of our involvement with the artificial eye. Now, these operations are few and far between. So Dobell traveled. He's an organizational genius. And he traveled with all the equipment to 33 different neurological clinics and centers in the United States to stimulate the brain of people under local anesthesia, this part of the brain.
And these are people who could not see. Is that correct?
No, these are normal people.
He
These
was trying to demonstrate.
Normal people that have their brain, happen to have their brain open. And he stimulated the brain, and sometimes they saw nothing, and sometimes they said, yes, I see a light. That was the basis then on which we worked further. And finally, we needed blind volunteers. So we had a panel of 24 blind people, blind for a long time. And we asked them what they wanted. They're not interested in reading, except a little sign that says man or women, so they don't have to ask. But what they really want is to have something so that they can walk around without bumping into other people. And I had not realized before that when they bump into other people, these other people are frightened, surprised, sometimes very rude and very impolite. And that is what the blind people want to avoid. So, as a result, we wanted to implant an array that's about, I think, this large, with 63 electrodes on it, on the not in, but on the visual cortex of a blind person. And the Institutional Review Board for Research on Human Subjects in Salt Lake City turned us down. So we had to go to London, Ontario, with all our equipment and all our personnel and the whole thing. And there we had Dr. Gervin, an excellent neurosurgeon, and we all went to the operating room and put the array of electrodes in it, and he said, I see light. This was a very emotional moment. This man hadn't seen anything for 28 years, and now he saw light. So I remember it very well. That's the only time that I went with Dubel to see what happened. Then, after 8 years, Bill Dubel went to New York, Presbyterian Hospital, and he continued, and I kind of dropped out. But I kept contact with Bill Dubel. And Bill Dubel has now gone to Lisbon, Portugal. And with the help of Dr. Antunes, who had implanted such an array for him at Presbyterian Hospital before, and Dr. Gervin, who was the guy in London, Ontario, and Dr. Smith from Louisiana, in Lisbon, Portugal, they implanted 8 totally blind people with 2 arrays of electrodes each. And all these 16 arrays of electrodes work. That means if you stimulate them, they all see lights. And after you have put that in, then you must find out, if you stimulate this point, where in the visual field does the man see it? There. And you must make a map of the visual field so that you know exactly, if I stimulate this point, he sees something there. If I stimulate that, he sees something there.
How does it work in people who have optic nerve damage? How do the impulses work?
The only thing that is needed is a brain that is intact. He doesn't have any nerve, he doesn't need any eyes, he doesn't need any optic nerve, but what he must have is an intact brain and the
so the sensors work.
And the afferent things that go from the brain to other parts of the body.
I see.
But that's the only thing he needs. So it can be used in all people, no matter what their brain damage is.
So it's an artificial eye.
It's the artificial eye.
You pioneered the artificial kidney. Tell me every other artificial organ that you've either had a hand in or single-handedly came up with yourself.
Let me finish the artificial eye because it's almost ready now. The artificial eye then was implanted in 8 people in Portugal. They all came back without complications. 3 of these people now are able to drive an automobile. The first man who looked out of the window with his artificial eye, he doesn't have any eyes, with his artificial eye said, I see an automobile, I'd like to drive it. And he said, well, why don't you try it? So he found his way to the automobile, got inside, and he could drive it, but he had trouble driving backwards because he could not use the rear view mirror. But he stuck his head out of the car and then he could drive the car backwards. 3 people are now able to drive automobiles in a parking lot on private property and slowly. And they put mannequins in the parking lot, and they haven't killed any of the mannequins. So that's the artificial eye. And the important thing is that it is commercially available. It costs about $90,000, and it seems that blind people can find the money for that. So the artificial eye is totally privately funded by people that want to have the artificial eye.
And you see this becoming widely used by blind people?
I think it will be widely used, yes. Blind people want it. We have had absolutely no problem getting volunteers.
Let me go back to the question I was asking you before you finished the eye story. The artificial kidney, you single-handedly devised that. You've had your hand in many artificial organs. List for me everything that you've been involved in.
Well, you said single-handedly. I always have co-workers. You can say I do as little as I can myself, but I find people that are willing to work with me, and many of those are smarter than I am. I'm not afraid of that at all. So it's always, and when we publish something, it's usually a row of other people, and my name is at the end of it. At a certain moment, there was a problem about the name of the artificial heart. It was called the Javik heart. And then, as long as it was used in sheep and calves, nobody was interested. But then when it was used in Barney Clark, a human patient, all kinds of people came up and said it should not be the Javik heart, it should have another name. I then counted the number of people, and only those that had their name on scientific publications that had worked with me on the artificial heart at the time that Barney Clark got it. The number was 147. So 147 people have had their names on scientific publications and have worked with me on the artificial heart. So I never do something alone, it's always with others.
Tell me then the number of, list for me the different types of organs that you've at least been involved in.
Well, one that I've been involved in is the intra-aortic balloon pump. It's now the most used LVAD. It's a long, slender balloon that is usually brought in through the femoral artery. It sits in the aorta, and then in between two heartbeats, it's suddenly blown up with CO2. And then when the next heartbeat comes, it collapses. So the heart doesn't have to do any work. The blood kind of falls out of the heart into the empty aorta. Then you blow up the balloon, and all the blood is then expelled by the balloon through the arteries, including the coronary arteries. And since it is contracting during diastole, when the coronaries are open, it's very effective in doing that. Now, I was not the inventor. The inventor were Molopoulos and Topaz. And Topaz is still working with me from time to time. Molopoulos came from Greece, and Topaz were the inventors, and I didn't kill it, and I get some credit for not having killed it. It is now the most used thing. And Kentruitz, from Maimonides Hospital in New York, he applied it in patients, and he started 5 years after we had published it. And I have just learned about a year ago from Dr. Golding, who was a resident at the time, that the cardiac surgeon at the Cleveland Clinic told his residents that they would be fired if they would ever use the intra-aortic balloon pump. And that is the reception that I have seen for nearly any artificial organ or other device you come up with.
Why do you think clinical physicians are reluctant to use newfangled devices?
Well, it's a new way of thinking. They have not been taught that way. The pacemaker, for example, had enormous resistance. The artificial kidney had enormous resistance. There was a doctor here in Presbyterian Hospital who refused to use the artificial kidney. And a medical student, Dr. Duncan, bought an artificial kidney, that was the twin coil artificial kidney from Baxter Laboratory, on credit from his own, and he applied it in Presbyterian Hospital here on a dog, so that everybody could see that it worked. But the chief of medicine didn't want to use it. So that the residents in Presbyterian Hospital referred patients in renal failure to other hospitals so that he could be treated with the artificial kidney. So now I've had one theory. When somebody, I remember one paper by a certain Dr. Stokes, wrote that the artificial kidney was no use, should not be used. I've never responded to it. If I had, I would have to spend all my time rejecting what these people said. I did not. Leave it alone, and they'll, in the long run, find out what happens.
It'll speak for itself.
Yeah.
You go on, though. You're not finished. What are you working on now?
I am now very much involved in the developing the wearable artificial lung. There is presently no help for people in end-stage pulmonary, that is lung failure. So end-stage asthma, emphysema, severe smoking, severe tuberculosis, although the tuberculosis may be healed, the lungs are so scarred there is not enough surface area. These people there is no help for. And I feel that with present technology it is possible to provide them with oxygen so that they don't have to breathe at all. After all, your lungs are to provide us with oxygen. And I believe that with presently existing oxygenators and existing pumps, it is possible to provide sufficient oxygen that the patient who's been gasping for breath for so long can just sit there and doesn't have to breathe at all.
Have you tried it yet in a patient?
No.
But you're working on it.
I'm working on it, and I told you that for the blind people we had a panel of blind people to tell us what they want. But I went to my friend Eli Friedman here at the Downtown Health Center of the University of New York, and he had spoken with Dr. Ackerman, a pulmonologist, and they brought some patients in pulmonary failure. And there were two that were very interesting. One was a mother of children between 4 and 14 years old. And the other one was a nurse, very intelligent, nice nurse. And after we had explained, first place, that you need a tube inside your body and that you have to carry this oxygenator here or there outside the body, and that you need a tank with oxygen on wheels, and a battery and so. After we had explained all these disadvantages, I said, do you still consider it? And the answer was yes. When I get worse, I would consider it. If I can take care of my children and see them through school. And the nurse said, if I can go back to nursing. And so we cannot, but they would have more mobility than the person in a wheelchair. They could probably walk as well as they ever could.
When do you think you would do the first clinical trial with a patient?
Well, now, the first clinical trial may be for another kind of patient. The FDA in this country will be very reluctant to give permission for this. But there are people that are dying. Dr. Barney Kryle was a very appreciated, was a friend of mine. He was a surgeon at the Cleveland Clinic. And I know from his wife Helga that when he died, although he had good friends that gave him anesthesia, etc., morphine, he said before he died, I cannot breathe, do something. In these dying patients that want to be done something, I think I can provide oxygen, and even if it doesn't prolong their life, that's not the person, I can make their dying easier. And that is the first approach that I will ask the FDA to permit.
Something that might be of interest to people who watch this is you've never become rich off your many, many inventions. Why is that?
Oh, I've been stupid.
Any advice to the young inventor?
Well, I set up 4 companies, 4 small companies, and they did well. And they gave me some money, but not very much. The kidney company we sold to Sandoz, and somebody in Switzerland killed that later on. The artificial heart I gave to somebody who became the president, and I made him president, although my wife and my secretary advised against it, and he mentioned to kill it. So at the time then, but that company, that he was not president yet, and the company went well, it was very okay, but he tried to outsmart the FDA. That's a stupid thing to do, and the company went down.
So you were a great inventor, but not so great a businessman. Would you say that's true?
Yeah. Some of my friends say that I'm not a good businessman.
When you look back, you could have rested on your laurels. What's made you keep going? What keeps igniting your interest and stimulating you to continue?
I wake up in the middle of the night. That's a good idea. I then get up and I have to write it down for fear that I will lose it. But that is something that really haunts me. And if I have a good idea, I keep thinking how to make it work. And that doesn't let me lose.
So you're not a person who sits around reflecting on the past. You're always looking into the future.
Very rarely do you get a very good idea while you're sitting at your desk working on it. You can have a good idea in a conference where several people exchange ideas, and that can be very, very fertile. In the Netherlands, I would ride on my bicycle the beautiful meadows outside the city of Kampen, and I would get very good ideas then. Or you get ideas when you're in bed and wake up. Slumber position is a good situation to get really good ideas. You have to be very careful that you write them down quickly, because you may lose them again. And sometimes you wake up and then you see that it's not such a good idea as you thought it was.
Let's talk about why you're here in New York City to receive the Lasker Award for clinical medical research. How does that feel?
Well, funny is that just when before I went to the train to come here, I received a letter from Dr. Paul Doolan. Dr. Paul Doolan was one of the people that applied the artificial kidney in the paddy fields in Korea, where it saved a lot of wounded soldiers. And he wrote me that 30 years ago, or around the time, he submitted my name for the Lasker Award. I didn't get it, but he wrote a delightful letter about it. My life might have been different if I had gotten that award at that time.
So, no regrets, though, for today and tomorrow. The future. Tell me about the future. You seem to be someone who can not only predict the future, but sort of make it happen. 20 years from now, what is the business of artificial organs like? Are we going to see artificial kidneys? Are we going to see, go on and on, artificial intestines? What else is possible?
Well, you can predict that I won't see that anymore because I'm 91 and a half now, but you can predict pretty well, I think, what is coming. Artificial kidneys will come, and they will probably be a wearable type that is the good type that runs day and night, or at least during the daytime, or end of the day is already starting. So artificial kidneys will stay. But I am not spending much time on an implantable artificial kidney because most of these people can have kidney transplants. And since we have 2 kidneys, we can give one away. That is not true for the artificial heart. So the artificial heart, you have no other choice than an artificial heart. There's no doubt in my mind that the artificial heart will come in large amounts. much larger than artificial kidneys.
Are you saying that there won't be a need for donor hearts as we
Will
see
be
now?
much later. And even now, I told you earlier that there should be holding centers where people waiting for a transplant can be treated with an LVAD or a total artificial heart. Many of these people will say, why don't you send me home with that artificial heart and you can give the donor heart to somebody else. So that is a predictable future. I just, as I said, hope that the Secretary of Health, Tommy Thompson, will support this idea. So that is the artificial heart, it'll come. Artificial liver is a composite of various artificial organs, and infusion future. It's beginning to bear fruit, but I have no personal experience, and I don't know much about it. But you can predict that a substitute liver will become available in a matter of, 10 years or so.
How do you feel the stem cell debate?
Oh, that's wonderful. That's an entirely new possibility. Did I tell you that some people that have been sustained with an LVAD, so that's left ventricular assist device, where a sick heart is now supported by a very good pump, and that natural heart that was so sick is now trying to regenerate, and to everybody's surprise, it grows new heart cells. And these heart cells are genetically different from the other heart cells. It proves that they're new heart cells. And if you could give stem cells to a patient who is in that condition, these stem cells will find a very fertile ground to work on. And Dr. Demin Shen in Bandung, Indonesia, who trained at the Cleveland Clinic, has a nice daughter, and the daughter is now in Japan learning how to grow stem cells. And in Bandung, Indonesia, hopefully using one of our LVADs, he will inject patients with stem cells. So that is a foreseeable development, but still very early.
You've had an incredible career that spanned many decades. Could you pick something that's been of greatest personal satisfaction to you in your career in science and medicine?
Well, it's a little difficult because while certain things came to clinical use, and that was sometimes extremely satisfying, I was already very much involved in something else which was not satisfying at all yet. But it's a great feeling that, for example, I was at the EDTA's meeting in Copenhagen, European Dialysis and Transplant Association, and a woman came up to me and said, I want to shake your hands because my husband has been on dialysis for 30 years. He cannot come because he's working. And she was, of course, very pleased, and so was I. And that's a good experience. I hear that one of the patients of Dr. Belding Scribner will be here tomorrow to be demonstrated at the Lasker Award. And in many places there have now been survivors of 28, 30 years with the artificial kidney.
So it was the human connection that you've always found more satisfying, hearing from patients what the science meant
wonderful
to them.
Oh yeah, that's very, very satisfying.
Tell me about Dr. Scribner. Did you work closely with him, or was this something that happened separately?
I knew Scribner. We were both members of the Society for Artificial Organs, and so and one day he came to the Society of Artificial Organs with his cannulas. And he was very good at it. He brought all the things with us to show us how they could be made. And within a week, I was using one of his cannulas. So he and I have been good friends.
And of course, you now share this terrific award.
Yeah, and so I'm very pleased. Now, Scribner worked on the West Coast, where medicine was better organized and developed so they could predict who their patients would be in the future. And he, out of desperation, not having enough artificial kidneys, set up the life and death committees. And I've always been mortally opposed to that. Arbitrage is possible when you are in the battlefield and there are 100 people coming in. You select those that you can save and the others ones you cannot do. But to select patients in our society and say he is worthwhile to have an artificial kidney and he is not worthwhile, what are the criteria? Well, I can give you the medical criteria. The first medical criterion is he an emotionally mature adult? I'm not sure that I would qualify.
You yourself.
Okay, that was the first medical question. Is he an emotional mature adult? If he's not, he's out. And there were other things. And then the civil criteria were, is he married or is he divorced? If he's divorced, he's out. Does he have children or have no children? Is he employed? Does he go to church? And I'm deadly opposed to this kind of selection of people who are worthwhile. I can understand it, that if you don't know what to do. I have a different approach. I then make more artificial kidneys, and that is when I started the washing machine artificial kidney. So the washing machine artificial kidney, the patient had a little machine which he could roll his own coils, and a Maytag washing machine cost almost nothing. No, that's not true. It cost about $200. So we sent 28 patients home with Maytag washing machines. And then one day the lawyer of the Maytag company came in my office, and I knew I was in trouble when I saw that lawyer. He pointed out that if one of my patients died on his washing machine, that the Maytag company might be liable. And the Maytag company was not in that kind of business, and they told their dealers that if they would sell the washing machines to Dr. Kolff, they would do so at their own risk. And they made it virtually impossible for me. I had to buy them on the black market. I didn't like that. So I spoke to Steve Jacobson, who was an engineering student, and he went to the Job Corps. And he convinced the Job Corps that he could make the nose cone of a rocket for us. And instead of the Maytag Washington, we then made the nose cone artificial kidney. And we sent a number of patients home with the nose cone artificial kidney. The trouble of that is there's not enough money involved to get industry interested. And you must have industry to really propagate it.
Is there anything you would advise the young inventor that you've learned along the way, the young clinical medical researcher, someone who wants to contribute in some way and has some good ideas? What would you advise someone?
Don't listen to people that tell you that it doesn't work.
Persist.
Yeah.
People told you along the way
Oh,
your
yes.
ideas wouldn't work.
I've been told many times that things would not work. And don't pay any attention to it.
That's great advice. That's great advice.
Okay?
Yeah.
Good.
Dr. Kolff, thank you
All right.
for your time today, and congratulations on the Lasker Award.
Thank you.